Helo pawb, croeso i podlediad Urdd Derwyddon Ynys Môn. Croeso cynnes i chi yma i swyddfa yr urdd yma ar Ynys Môn. Hello everybody, welcome to the latest podcast from the Anglesey Druid Order. You are very welcome here to the office of the Order on the Isle of Anglesey. If you hear some noises in the background, we share this enormous space with other people and it's bingo night. So there might be some shenanigans in the background. But other than that, I am joined by the splendiferous, the fabulous, the amazing, the altogether far too many adjectives to describe Mhara Starling.
Hello.
Hello, ti'n iawn?
Good now. Oh my gosh, wonderful to be back.
I know, right. It seems like it was, oh my word, do you know, it was Calan Gaeaf.
Almost a year ago.
It is nearly a year. We had Jenna Tulundrew here
We did.
with us, which was rather lovely. And now we are facing, well, by the time this goes out, we'll be towards the middle of the first harvest, which is, I've got to admit, my favourite season. Oh, is it my favourite season? Maybe that's winter. But I love the autumn. It's just that harbinger, isn't it? It's the change in air. It's the change in temperature. It's the opportunity to bring out cardigans.
It is.
And coats. I know you love to flounce in a coat.
Oh, I do. Flounce in a coat, or anything that's just layered and lovely. I just love that I have known you now for, what is it, over a decade, 15 years, something like that?
It must be 15 years or so, if not a bit more, yeah.
And I still remember one of the first things anyone ever said to me after I started hanging out with the Druids and doing things with you was, oh, is he the one that has the house that's just ridiculously overdecorated at Halloween and Christmas? So yeah, I think your favourite season must be between those two,
Very
based
much
on
so,
your house.
Very much so. Our house is like a beacon of orange and purple when it comes to Calan Gaeaf Halloween season. So just in case, because you never know, somebody might have been under a rock for the last 10 months and might not know who you are, which I find quite difficult to believe. So just in case that any of those people exist out there, tell us who is, what is, why is Mhara Starling?
Oh gosh, well, why is, I have no idea. But what is, so yeah, my name's Mhara. I'm originally from just down the road here on Ynys Môn, the Isle of Anglesey, and I class myself nowadays as a Welsh witch. I'm also a member of the Anglesey Druid Order and a wenydd of the Order. And these days I'm also an author and I usually do strange things online. So people might have seen some of my videos where I'm either talking very profoundly about Welsh mythology and magic, or I'm rolling down hills talking about how pigs are actually fairies and Welsh women used to curse people with their magical tits. So that's kind of the gist of what I do these days, and I've been really fortunate to have travelled around the width and breadth of the UK talking about Welsh myth, lore and magic. I run my own courses, I do my own classes, but I'm also just a little weirdo who lives on the island, who loves to potter about with my books and my herbs and my witchy things and do all manners of magical things, and I'd love to share that with people. So yeah, I suppose that sums me up. I refer to myself in Welsh as a swinwraig, not a gwrach.
That's an important definition.
Yeah. So gwrach is a no-no for me, which is odd because that's usually what the dictionary or what Google Translate would tell you a witch is in Welsh.
Yeah.
But I prefer swinwraig because it basically translates to mean somebody who is a practitioner of the art of enchantment, and I love that. But it's also a historical term, so it goes back through our folk traditions and our folk practices. And I like to think it just sounds a little nicer than gwrach as well.
It does. It does. And I'm more than happy to call myself, especially when practicing magic, the magical arts, to be a swin or technically, I suppose. But I like the term swinid, which is remarkable, right? That we have this gender neutral term, an old term, but that it's there, that we have a swin or a man of magic, swinwraig, a woman of magic, and then a swinid, which I really like. But talking about all of the lovely things that you get up to, oh, you can add something else to your list of doing lovely things.
Can I?
Jam making.
Jam making, yeah, that's a new one on me. I don't cook. I don't like cooking. I'm very bad at it. I make cupcakes taste like fish. But we've just moved into a house that has the most gorgeous damson trees and apple trees and blackberries galore. So I've dipped my toes in jam making, and it's actually really easy. So
It's quite
I
good,
loved
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, be prepared. Now that everything's coming into season, blackberries, rowan berries, elderberries, apples, you're going to have purple fingers
Yeah, for a while.
for a while. Unless you wear some rubber gloves. Good.
I do love a good glove.
So, talking about your writing career, your explorations into the literary realms,
Mm.
and your successes in the literary realms as well. Here is Mhara's latest book, published by Collective Ink or Moon Books, and they've got a new series called Pantheon. There's a few in this series now, isn't there?
There is. I've had a few people reach out to me and ask me, why did you choose this title for this book? And I didn't really choose the title. It's just the system they use for this new series. So I think Moon Books is mostly well known for their Pagan Portals series.
Yeah.
A lot of people refer to them as the Pagan Portals publisher. So Pagan Portals is a series in and of itself, and I have another book within that series as well. And Pantheon is the same. So Pantheon is the name of the series, and then there's different books for a variety of different cultures and pantheons. So they all refer to the gods of a particular culture or a particular era. And I'm just one of the very lovely bunch who has written a book for this series.
And they're actually a little bit chewier than Pagan Portals as well, aren't they? I think they've got a little bit more in the way of word count.
Yeah, they're around double the size of
Yeah.
a Pagan Portal.
So why this particular book, when they asked you, when Collective Ink approached you and asked you to write this, was it something that you felt an immediate draw towards? Did you have any reservations maybe about writing it? And why at that particular point in time did this feel right for you to bring out into the world?
Oh gosh. So I remember when I was first approached, because I was approached for this one, which was a different experience, because I'm used to usually just coming up with an idea and then sending that idea off to someone and hoping, praying, and crossing my fingers that they'll accept it. But with this one of the lovely folks at Collective Ink at Moon Books, they reached out to me and they said, we're developing our Pantheon series and we would love to include representation of the Welsh gods, the Welsh Pantheon. So would you be willing to write it? And I'll be really honest and say that initially I was absolutely taken over by anxiety, and I thought, I'm not the right person to write that book. Why are they asking me? Especially because you write for Moon Books as well. And I thought, do they not have somebody who is perhaps more better suited for it? So there's you, there's Jenna, there's all sorts of people within Collective Ink, within Moon Books that write about the Welsh gods. So I was wondering, why me? And I did ask that. I went, why me? And they just said, well, we'd love your perspective on it, especially because you haven't written a book that's specifically about the gods yet or about polytheism, and you do practice polytheism. And for a while, I kind of ummed and ahed about it and wasn't sure, because though I do identify as a polytheist, my relationship with the gods is something that I think I don't struggle with, but I am a little bit nervous about sharing a lot of the time, because I'm worried that I don't fit into the box of what a polytheist is supposed to look like. And I remember sitting there thinking about all these debates and discussions that go on in the pagan world about, soft polytheism and hard polytheism, and where do I fit into these boxes, and do I have to fit into one or the other, or could I be something in between? And how does it work with the Welsh gods? Do they fit into one particular expression or not? And then I worried, are some people going to hate this book because it's not about ancient pre-Christian Brythonic deities or archaeology? It's about the gods that I actually interact with. And most of those come from Welsh culture. Because I have had a few people reach out and go, I don't understand why it's called the Welsh when it could just be like Brythonic or Celtic in general. And, there's a reason it's called the Welsh, because the gods in here are the Welsh gods. They're the gods tied to this land, to the language I speak, to the culture I interact with daily. So there was a lot of reservations at first, and I felt like perhaps I wasn't the best suited because I wasn't sure if I had the fortitude to put up with the questions and the criticisms that people would fling at it, even if they haven't read it. They'll make a decision based on the cover and based on the title alone. And I've had that already now that it's out. But at the same time, I sat there and I thought to myself, maybe this is an opportunity as well for me to deepen my relationship with the gods. And I do see this book as almost an offering to those gods, as a way of me reaching out and saying, I hope that in writing this, I might inspire others to sing in joy and in reverence of you, and hopefully you'll accept that as an offering. So it was a little bit of an anxiety-inducing task because I felt like, oh gosh, could I do this and do it justice as well? But at the same time, I thought maybe this is a challenge from the gods themselves that I need to
Yeah.
have a bit more confidence in the way that I perceive and understand things. And it's a jumping board. That's what I hope, that it's a way for people to dive into what polytheism might look like from a specifically Welsh expression and then go off and make their own practice from that.
Fab. Right, so let's dive into it because it follows a lovely pattern. We've got the historical perspective, the mythological perspective, and a lot of people out there might already have a grasp of that, particularly if they've read your book, if they've read my books, or Genital Andrews, or done any work with people like Dr. Gwilym Morris Baird. And I don't really want to cover or look at the historical perspective of where the tales and the myths come from. I want to jump a little bit forward into the chapter that you cover on cosmology, which is fascinating, right? And I've got little notes in my book. I've got little notes and little dots and little pieces of paper. And what I found quite interesting with that particular component of the book is that I've found that in my own work as a polytheist, one of the primary criticisms that I've faced over the years as a modern Welsh polytheist is people will say, oh, but then you don't have a cosmology. So if you don't have a cosmology, you can't have any gods. And initially I found that stumped me a little bit, but in your book, you cover that rather beautifully and succinctly in looking at the elements, not elephants, the elements of cosmology within the Welsh literal, within the Welsh bardic tradition, within our storytelling tradition, which covers things like the existence and this deep belief in an other world that's given this name, Anwfn, and also from the bardic perspective, this mystical component, which is Awen, this divine, holy spirit of creation blowing through everything. And what I like is that when people look at cultures like ours, if they're not necessarily privy to the nuts and bolts within that culture, they may not be able to identify the things that make cosmological sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that in missing that, they miss the components in which we can extrapolate a cosmology. So do you think that the cosmology that we are able to discover as modern day polytheists is as valid as any other ancient cosmology which inspires other spiritual traditions? Does the fact that we have to extrapolate a cosmology denigrate it, or does it actually highlight a deep magic that's still there, available to us?
Oh, big question. But I think in some ways, the fact that we have to kind of find these jigsaw pieces and try and put them together and understand them and perceive them in a way that's almost unique to each individual person, I think that's, if anything, a method of deepening your relationship to this kind of practice, to a polytheistic practice that draws on these sources and such. Because rather than just following instruction or following, the lead of the ancestors or the ancient ones, we have to figure it out for ourselves. And that can be a hindrance in some ways. And I know there's a lot of people out there. I've had conversations with people who struggle with the fact that, we don't have as many, say, word for word rituals that we can practice. We don't have as many little things that we can turn to and do as daily practice and all this, in the same way that somebody who might perhaps be drawing inspiration from ancient Greek or Greece or Rome or Egypt or anything like that might have. And yet, I think there's also a little bit of a kind of nice element to that as well, in that we then have to think for ourselves and we have to figure out how this cosmology might have existed, but also how it exists in the world that we're in now. So I think a big part of my own polytheism and something I've had to grapple with over time is that I have no interest, and no desire to try and recreate the practices of the ancient world, because the way I see it is we don't live in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Our world is very different to the world of our most ancient ancestors in so many ways. Like just the fact we're sat here right now recording a podcast which people will listen to all over the world, that in and of itself marks us as quite other to the people of the past who would have predominantly only really interacted with their closest community within their square mile. So there's so many elements of our world now that is so different that I think, there is this need within modern polytheism to ask, how does this stuff fit within the here and now? And when we are extrapolating and putting these jigsaw pieces together, we don't really have to contend with as much of that pressure of tradition, because we can just take this and go, okay, this is perhaps how it would have been perceived in the past, but how is it perceived, and not only perceived but expressed in the here and now? What do we need from it now, and how do we share our inspiration that we've drawn from these sources with the world now? So I don't think that there's any less validity to our practices just because we don't have as deep and as clear of a background of written sources. We're a culture that didn't write things down before the coming of Christianity. Nothing was written down. We're an oral culture in that way. And I think the fact that we have nothing written down except for after the Christian period started, I think that, if anything, connects us to our ancestors in a way, because then our cosmology and our polytheism has to become rooted in story and song and rumour and whisper. And, that's how they would have shared their magic and their understanding of the world. They wouldn't have had these books handed down to them telling them this is historically how you worship the gods. They would have been told about it around campfires. They would have sat and sang the praise of their gods. So, if anything, even though I say I don't have an interest in trying to recreate the ancient past, my practice is rooted in the here and now. I do think in some ways the fact that we have to dig into story and song and be in community and have conversations about these things connect us even deeper to the way our ancestors might have operated, because that's how they would have done it too.
And I guess even the way in which we practice today might not actually be that dissimilar to the way our ancestors would practice in the past.
No.
Even though we're different people, we've got new technologies, but I don't think as people that we're that different, and that the needs that we have probably express themselves in very similar ways to whether it's our ancestors 2000 years ago during the last golden age of the ancient Celts to 5,000 years ago at Bryn Celli Ddu or Barclodyd y Gawres, But I think as well that there's an interesting point in that. Obviously, the book is called Pantheon, the Welsh. And just the fact that it's called the Welsh, to me, is a hint at a cosmology. Like you said, it isn't the Brythonics, the Bretons, the Britons, the Britannics. It's none of those. It's the Welsh. And the way in which we as modern day Welsh polytheists are connecting to the gods is very much through that particular lens. Now, I don't know how, I'm going to go shady on everybody's asses now. And the shade comes from, I find that sometimes I'm affronted almost when somebody will tell me that they don't necessarily connect with Rhiannon. They connect instead with Rigatona. Perhaps the echo of who Rhiannon might have been in the ancient world. And you think, okay, fair enough, you're entitled to that particular opinion. But as a Welsh person, a small part of me winces when I hear that kind of discourse, because it feels then that any validity that Rhiannon might have as a descendant of Rigatona or as an echo of Epona from the Celto-Romano culture, that she doesn't mean anything. And I find that somewhat makes me cringe a little, because if Rigatona, or whoever Rigatona was, and when the Romans came, and that figure may not have morphed seamlessly into this figure of Epona, and then eventually through the Cyfarwydd tradition and the Bardic tradition, Rhiannon developed, the same echo, the same name, the same association with horses. So I like that fact that it's called the Welsh and that it does so on the cover. It seems very unapologetic.
Mm.
It's not trying to disguise the polytheistic principles that we work with today as anything other than what they are.
Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
Welsh, and it honours that particular culture, strain, and the stories that we tell ourselves. And to me, that is the beginnings of a cosmology, and that anything else that we consider, whether it's this association that our ancestors have, that we still have with Anov and with Awen, with interactions that are otherworldly in nature. And as Welsh people, I think you would agree, there's always been an aspect of the way in which we were brought up. We were brought up with those stories, that the other world was nearby.
Yeah, it's always present. And it's something that I did talk a little bit about in the introduction to this book is that when I was developing my polytheistic practice or my pagan practice, when I first took my tentative little steps towards witchcraft and magic and paganism, I remember at first I was drawn to, all these books that you can very easily get at that point from charity shops or from W.H. Smith on paganism and witchcraft. And because those books talked about gods from cultures that were far, far away from here, I did initially try and develop a relationship with those gods. So, like living close to the sea, I tried to develop a relationship with Poseidon. And I remember buying necklaces with depictions of like Egyptian deities and such, because I felt like that's what the books are saying, that's what I have to do. And then when I started really thinking about it, when I was getting deeper into my teen years and I was really starting to consider, well, what about the gods of here? What about the gods that exist here in this land right now? I remember learning a little bit about what we know about the Romano-Celtic gods and, what little echoes we have of what the Brittonic or the Britons would have actually worshipped or venerated in this landscape prior to the coming of Christianity. But there was always this little disconnect. There was always this kind of feeling of, but they're not the culture that I've been raised in. This is something beyond me now. And then when I started reading about Welsh deities and started hearing about Welsh deities, it was this strange situation where I knew these characters, I knew these beings already, maybe just not in that context. And yet, the context of polytheism wasn't that hard, wasn't that deep underneath the surface. It wasn't that hard to scratch away and find that polytheistic component because the way we're taught about the Mabinogi, Awen, Annovan, all of these concepts in Welsh culture today, if you are privileged enough to be in a part of Wales that does teach you about this stuff as we were, then there wasn't like this disconnect between the spiritual and the visceral and profound components of these things. It was very much overt. People talked about the Awen in an almost mystical and spiritual way, even if they were chapel going teachers in going to Sunday school every morning and such to teach, they were still talking about it as if it was this energetic current that we can tap into, that we can breathe in, and that we can move in the world with the power propelling us to create amazing and profound things. Similarly, Annov and the other world, we perhaps if you were to ask someone from my village where I grew up in, do you believe in the existence of Annovan? They'd probably just like, no, of course not instantly. But then their stories and their beliefs surrounding the way in which we participate in certain celebrations throughout the year seem to paint a different picture entirely. So like, Calan Gaeaf, the story I used to always be told at Calan Gaeaf was don't stay out too late or the Hwch Ddigwta will drag you to Anov.
Oh, that's great. Oh, she'll get you.
It's like, so no, we don't believe in Anov, but and there's always that but, and I loved that. And I just kind of loved that for me, it was less of an interaction of trying to find these gods, and it was more like reacquainting myself
They
with
were already
familiar,
here.
yeah, with familiar friends. And the ADO helped me with that because that's when I met you and the order, and I started going to your rituals and your events. And it was that kind of opened my eyes and made me go, oh, I can just call to the gods of here. I don't need to be calling to the gods of far, far away or time periods long in the past. I can look right here beneath my feet in my square mile and to the stories that I'm intimately familiar with from my childhood. and it's there and it's clear.
I think that I think that is there's an animistic element to that as well, isn't there? I mean, the region where the Order's office is, the part of the island that we live, is not that far from the location of Branwen and Bran, and their myths and stories are interlaced into this land, even from the details of elements of the landscape. Well, they're still here. We can visit them. Did you find that that enabled you to have a different perspective of deity as opposed to that which we had? I mean, I'm not too sure to what extent you were programmed by monotheism. I guess to a degree we all are in this culture. But our gods feel very different to a monotheistic, exalted God. So growing up in Aberfraw, being able to visit these places, to be able to see Llanwyn Island and see the Kingdom of Gwynedd directly opposite, did it feel as if that polytheism began almost from a platform of animism first, of a spirit inherent within the land speaking to you, rather than something coming down upon you?
Yeah, definitely. I think an interesting story I love to share with people is to do with my favorite place in Aberfraw, which was the place that I always escaped to. It was the place that I always ran away to whenever life was overwhelming and things were too much. That was always the place I'd go. And I was very fortunate to have grown up in such a quiet little village. So even though, I grew up in the generation that people in the generation before me are often like, oh, you didn't get the freedoms that we did. You didn't play outside on your bikes. And I'm like, we did, because I lived in a very sleepy village. Like, there was no fear about where the children were. So my playground growing up was the beach, the coastal path, the fields and the hills behind the house. And I would sometimes walk for miles and miles. And I loved just being immersed in that landscape because you could walk for hours and not see a single other person for a whole day if you wanted to. And there was one particular spot in the village that I was always gravitating towards, and locally we call it a peak. And a peak, its actual official name is Trwyn, which is a common name for cliffs, isn't it, in Wales? It's like the black point of the area, and it just so happens that the rocks in Aberfraw are these black volcanic rocks as well. So it almost describes the area. It's the nose of the island, and it's this black peak, and you look around and you see those black stones jutting out from the ground. And it's a cliff that overlooks the mountains of Eryri, so the mountains of Snowdonia. They're there right in front of you, and the sea is there just lapping at the shores. So it's a place where land, sea, and sky sings in harmony. And there's a bench there, but as a child, I never went to the bench to sit. I always went to the very edge of the cliff where there just happens to be this crescent shape of stones. And I used to sit in this crescent shape of stones and just look out at the landscape. And I remember from as early on as I can even remember going to that place, I called that place the place I go to pray. And I didn't have as much monotheistic programming because I didn't have a family that went to church. I didn't have any of that. So most of my interaction with Christianity was through school when we did the nativity plays, or we did Diolchgarwch, which is our Thanksgiving, where we went to church and we sang about fruit or something like that. And so those instances were the only times I really had any interaction with God and Jesus and Christianity and all this. So I had an idea of what praying and such was, but it wasn't something that my family did. It wasn't something that we really believed. So I would go and I would pray in this area, in this crescent shape of stones. And my praying usually involved me just looking up at the sky and seeing the sea and the land in front of me, the mountains coming up from the distance in front of me, and just feeling something that was beyond myself. And then talking to it actually out loud, which for any tourists that were wandering around the coastal path at that point, I probably looked really mad because I was just sat there muttering to what they would think is myself. But I would go there and I would just talk to whatever it was that I was reaching out to. And, being a child, sometimes I'd ask for things. I'd say, please help me find friends. Please help me, get that toy I really want, things like that. And sometimes it would come true. And then I'd go back and I'd thank them and I'd give them some kind of gift in the form of song or something like that. And all that developed quite naturally just from being in relationship with the land. I hadn't read any pagan books at that time. But then when I did start reading pagan books, I realized, oh, I'm already doing a lot of this. And the land has obviously taught me how to be in relationship with the spirits that inhabit this landscape with me. And then the strangest thing that makes me always think, oh my gosh, that's such an interesting synchronicity, is when I was around 15 or 16, I bought a book on ancient monuments on Anglesey, and I instantly skipped to the index and looked for the name of my village to see, do we have any standing stones? Do we have any chambers like Bryn Cyhydd in Aberfraw? And instantly it said Trwyndy in the index in Aberfraw. And I thought to myself, what do you mean Trwyndy? Like that place I always go to pray to my gods. And I read the entry on Trwyndy, and that semicircle, or what you see now as a semicircle, that crescent shape, is the remnant of a Bronze Age cairn. And I remember reading so deeply about the practices that might have been carried out there because they found burnt chestnuts and all manners of offerings, as well as human remains. And there used to be a pile of stones in the middle, and that crescent shape you see now used to be a full circle. But by today, the sand has started to cover it up and all this. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is real because something pulled me there. And obviously, this is a place that people have interacted with for thousands upon thousands of years. And I knew none of that. In my local area, that area was sometimes referred to as the place where Branwen got married. So there were some stories that my teachers would tell me about how those stones were the altar stones of the wedding.
Yeah.
But other than that, we never thought of it as an ancient monument. Nobody ever told me it was an ancient monument, but something in me knew. And I think that's how my relationship with these gods really developed. It's a mixture of knowing the stories and knowing the songs and the poems that have arisen within our culture about them. But also, it's about listening to the land. And it's almost as though the land itself was teaching me how to interact with it. And I think that's the biggest lesson anybody approaching this can ever learn, is that sometimes the best way to be in relationship is to just listen and develop that relationship naturally. So yeah, I think to me, I see my path as developing initially in a very animistic way. And then from that, I became a nerd and started studying and just got obsessed.
So let's talk about the nitty gritty, because invariably what we find when we write about polytheism from a Welsh perspective, we will usually encounter the naysayers. The people who will say, you are talking absolute bollocks. There is no evidence. There are no cults. There were no shrines to these gods. And some people, I find, can get pretty angry about it, which I find surprising. And usually, in my experience, I find that the people who sound very angry about it usually comes from academia. And then there are other people who just don't necessarily have any understanding of polytheism in general and just feel very critical of it because we're primarily brought up as monotheists. You've got a whole chapter in here that goes into that particular detail of the reason why these are gods. So from your perspective, and perhaps as well in response or in reaction to the way in which we can be criticized as polytheists, how are these gods? How are they gods? What makes them gods? But also, why are they gods?
Oh gosh. So there's so many ways you can approach that question, and I tried to cover as many different approaches in the book within the limited word count, of course, because you could write a whole book on that topic alone, like what makes a god, what makes a deity, what classes something as a deity. And one thing that I find really interesting as well is I do find that the majority of criticism tends to come from either the academic spheres, where these stories are interacted with predominantly as literature. They're seen as medieval literature and nothing more. And there was a time in academia when these stories were viewed as being the echoes of an ancient mythology. And I think there's a tendency nowadays for people to try and move away from the mysticism of it all. And there's an understanding in my mind of why they do that, why they're trying to move away from the enchantment and mysticism of these stories and these characters, because there has been decades upon decades of people misconstruing our culture and warping it to fit their own agendas, especially people from outside of our culture. You could just go into the backlogs of pagan publishing and find numerous books about Welsh gods from the 80s and 90s. And you could open it up as a Welsh person and instantly go, well, that's a load of shit, isn't
Yeah.
it? And so I kind of understand the backlash against that and why nowadays some academics will want to separate themselves as far away from that as possible and see this is serious research. This isn't new age pap. This is stuff that requires serious study. But I think the pendulum has swung a little bit too far. And because the pendulum has swung too far in the area of academia, and I am saying this as somebody who's not in academia, so I have had criticism in the past where people will go, how would you know that that's what academics think when you're not in academia? And it's like, oh gosh, I go on JSTOR, I can read articles, and I've seen the attitude coming from people in interviews and in writings and in books and such. But because academia views it in that way, there is this seepage now into paganism and occultism where people will go, well, this is what the academics think, and they're obviously the clever people with their degrees, so you must be talking out of your arse and they must be the ones that are correct. But what intrigues me about that is that the definition that they're giving when they say that these deities that we revere now are not gods is usually along the lines of there's no evidence of any cults, there's no evidence of ancient worship, there's no evidence that predates the coming of Christianity of these entities being referred to as anything other than literary characters. But then in the same breath, the people within occultism and paganism that, have these criticisms about Welsh polytheism, they will acknowledge the deific nature of entities like Aradia, who, we know a lot of it came from Charles Godfrey Leyland, or they will venerate Baphomet as an entity or a deity in its own right. Again, another entity that, perhaps the name has a bit of a storied history, but the figure that we know now as the horned goat figure with the all manners of
The Eliphas
details.
Levi one?
Yeah, the Eliphas Levi Baphomet. That's relatively modern as well. And we have no evidence that there was a cult to Baphomet either. So I find it interesting that people will flip flop on their opinions of what classes as deity and what doesn't. But the arguments that I pose in this and in my work in general when I talk about this with anyone is, number one, if we're looking for any ancient origin for these deities, we don't need to look any further than their names. Their names instantly give us a link to the ancient past. There are some deities that are very clearly linked to pre-Christian pagan deities that were being venerated either on the continent in Gaul or here in Britain. And that's ones like Matrona, Maponos. We have Gwynap Nudd, who derives from Nodens. His father is Nudd, which derives from Nodens. There are various different figures that obviously, yes, Lu. There are numerous different figures who have these names that obviously have been carried from something older. So there is, perhaps an argument to be made there that maybe they carry an echo, that there is some echo of who they were. And it's interesting to me that when you look into a deity like, say, Maponos, who then, when he entered into Welsh vernacular and literature, became Mapon, we see similar traits. So Maponos, we know based on Roman shrines dedicated to him and such, that he was seen as the Celtic equivalent of Apollo, and that he was associated with hunting, and he's often depicted with dogs. And then Mabon in the stories of Welsh mythology or literature is a hunting figure who has dogs at his disposal, who is, very much associated with poetry and the bardic tradition. And he's the divine son. His name literally means the divine son. So all of that points to a deific kind of representation of a being within that regard. And even just that alone, the fact that his name ends in on, similar to Rhiannon and all the others, which literally means divine or great or exalted person, somebody who is revered and venerated and worshipped. And I think those clues point us in direction that perhaps these are, if not direct, lines coming from pre-Christian practice, they're at least echoes of something that existed before, and they've just been transplanted into what is now Welsh culture. So of course I'm going to interact with them through that, because Welsh culture is the way I view the world. So it makes just sense to my mind like that. But I think as well, it's time that we do away with this obsession with trying to quantify or authorize our beliefs with antiquity. I don't think we need to validate what we do by saying because it's ancient.
It doesn't authenticate it, does it?
No.
It doesn't. I don't think any tradition needs the permission of the past in order to exist, because that would imply that there would never have been anything new.
No, exactly. And a lot of it, what I find particularly interesting as somebody who has an interest in the development of modern pagan witchcraft, I love reading into the history of the development of Wicca, traditional witchcraft, Cochranian witchcraft, all this kind of stuff. What I love about it is that it's such a rich history, and yet what that history teaches us is that things become really dodgy the minute you try and validate your beliefs with antiquity, because the minute you set that standard that your beliefs have to be ancient in order to be valid, then people start making stuff up. Then people start making bold claims about being, a hereditary witch who has descended from a line of witches that goes all the way back to ancient Babylon, and their ancestors have been practicing the same witchcraft for the last 3,000 years and all this. A lot of which is just absolute poop, isn't it? It's not true. And so I think it makes more sense to me to just acknowledge that maybe we don't know as much about what the ancients were doing, but we do know what we're doing now. And I think it's really interesting that, these beings, whether they are literary characters alone or the echoes of ancient gods, they are now venerated across the world by people of all different backgrounds, faiths, races, nationalities, all sorts. No matter who you are, there is probably somebody in your city or your town who has a shrine to Branwen or Arianrhod or Rhiannon. There are now temples dedicated to these beings. There are entire, pagan groups and orders and circles built around veneration of these deities, not just here in Wales, but in America and Canada. I even know people in Japan who venerate
the
the
world,
Welsh gods.
indisputably.
And
The
so,
ship has sailed, right?
yeah, the ship has sailed. By now, regardless of what history tells us, they are gods. And I find it a little frustrating sometimes that people aren't interested in that, because I'd love to read, a proper thesis or some kind of dissertation written by somebody studying Celtic studies, going into why are they calling to us now? Why are these beings being called to as gods now? And how did this develop into what it is today? But instead, there's this animosity towards paganism, and I find that sad.
And do you think that, I wonder whether, I'm not entirely sure where that animosity comes from. I've certainly come across it plenty of times. And sometimes I find I will react fairly strongly against it, because what they don't expect is for you to bite back. And I'll bite back, and kind of my argument, particularly towards that prevalent idea that these are not gods, is that to me that's an element of gatekeeping from one perspective alone. And to the critical academics there are out there, I will say, you don't own this material. It belongs to us. It's ours to do what we feel necessary with it, because it belongs to the people. It was never the realm of the learned alone, exclusively so. And if the critics would like to explore, I'm not entirely sure why they wouldn't explore such concepts as apotheosis. I find the process of apotheosis deeply intriguing and interesting, because I think apotheosis speaks of a need that people or individuals have a deep need for something, and the numinous will rise to serve that need. And then by the process of apotheosis, which I would imagine every single god and goddess out there all came from processes of apotheosis. And I don't really see an awful lot of people talking about apotheosis or apotheoetic. Is that a word?
I don't know. It is now.
Processes, you know? And so, and it's interesting that you mentioned as well that there's a need. They seem to be arising in the spiritual consciousness of so many people all around the world, these Welsh gods, because elements of their stories, whilst we might consider them to be ancient, the elements of these characters, archetypes, gods, constructs are timeless, right? There's a timelessness to the wisdom or counsel or succor that we can glean from them. And that's certainly why I'm a polytheist. But do you find as well that sometimes when those criticisms are thrown at us, you know, oh, there's no evidence that they existed in the past, my reaction to that is, your point is that they're relevant now, and because they're relevant now, we're able to explore their depths, and we thank academia for that, because so many people in academia have contributed to the deeper understanding and acknowledgement, sometimes from some corners of academia, of why these are necessary principles in our lives today. And but do you, when you consider the gods, what are they?
Oh gods. I think that's a question that I'm still struggling with to this day. And I think my opinion on this will always change and evolve. And I hope most people will too, because we're not, a centralized religion like many monotheistic traditions and such today that have a centralized component, governing body that tells you what God is and how you interact with God and who owns the gods. We don't have that. That's not a part of our tradition, if you can call it that, our practices, our beliefs. We are very much, there's pros and cons to this, but in many ways, the way in which we express our polytheism is somewhat new and has an echo of something old as well. So because it's so new, it's still in its kind of tentative steps nowadays. When you think about how long it's been since people were even able to identify publicly as pagan, we haven't come that far since then. We don't have as many temples and churches or orders that kind of govern how we interact with the gods. And even when organizations are set up to enable you or help you in developing a relationship, often they still leave that a little open for interpretation. They say, we're not here to tell you how the gods exist. We are here to help you figure that out for yourself. And I think my interpretation or my understanding of the gods is constantly in flux and it's fluid. But what I find interesting about that is that they seem to be like that too. The gods themselves tend to be fluid. Recently, I was doing a class on one of my favorite poems from Wales, one of the ancient poems that we have. And that poem is attributed to Taliesin. And Taliesin is complicated because, I think based on the world that we live in now, people are always looking for canon, as in like what is the true story and the true canon that can't be broken about these gods. But the gods aren't that simple. They're not as easy as to say they are this and they are that alone. So Taliesin is one of the best examples because in the poem that I was teaching about or talking about with the people who support me via my pages and such, there's an origin story for Taliesin in it. And the origin story is not the story of him being born from Ceridwen. It's a completely different origin story. And some people really struggle with that. They're like, no, this story says this is how he was born. How can he also have been born like this? That doesn't make sense. And I think my only way of helping people understand that is to basically state that Taliesin isn't a person. He's not one singular person who existed although there was a historical Taliesin as well, which complicates things even further. But he's not this one being who existed, who has one canon story and that's that. He is something that seems to have arisen over and over and over again, and even some of our texts talk about that. How he comes when the need is there. He arrives, and sometimes he's called Taliesin, but other times he's called Merlin, and perhaps he has a different name by today. And I think that fluid nature of Taliesin gives me a deeper understanding of the gods as these fluid beings as well. And that's not to say, that they are wibbly wobbly, soft polytheistic concepts that exist psychologically within your mind only, and so it depends on the person. I'm not a soft polytheist in that regard. I don't see the gods as purely just archetypes or aspects of our psyche. I do think they exist and they are real and they are out there listening to us, talking to us, but also living their own lives as well. So I wouldn't necessarily class myself as a hard polytheist either, because that comes with baggage. And I don't always conform to what some people dictate a hard polytheist is meant to be. But I do lean more towards hard polytheism with some squishy, flaccid tendencies sometimes. And
There's some
so,
soft polytheism
yeah,
thrown in there.
thrown in
It's,
there.
euhemerism
Yeah,
and archetypal stuff, and because I think I fall in the same category. I understand what the divisions of polytheism are, like the soft, hard, euhemeristic, and so forth. But every time I either look at those concepts or I'm writing about those concepts, I go, oh yeah, I'm that. And then I'll go on to writing about the next one. I'll go, oh no, no, I'm that one. And then by the time I've finished writing about, is it 7 divisions or 6 divisions? I'm like, oh shit, I'm all of them. But I think that's actually okay.
yeah,
That because it doesn't have to be, in my opinion, defined to the nth degree, because there's an element within polytheism for me that is so deeply connected to the land.
yeah,
And I understand why some people from different cultures will have personified certain places, rivers, volcanoes, hills, streams, mountains, lakes, and those personalities will have evolved and developed over time. But as you were describing your time at Druidry, and I've had similar experiences as a child, that personality was already inherent in the land itself and is speaking through the land. And I think it's only human nature to want to name that, because but that is a personality, right? It's alive, it's inherent, and to us in 21st century polytheism, they're gods
yeah.
and goddesses.
And I think the more we try and narrow it down and, try and shove what we understand the gods to be in a box, in my experiences, the gods will then slap you over the head and remind you that, no, you can't do that to me. You can't try and squeeze me into one box and keep me there. I will prove you wrong over and over and over again. And I think to me, that is reflective of a lot of things within our world, like nature, for example. We have an obsession as humans with trying to compartmentalize things and shove things into very neat, tidy boxes. But our world doesn't work like that. And if our world doesn't work like that, then the universe probably doesn't work like that. And if the universe and the world doesn't work like that, then why should the gods? So I think I'm always a bit nervous about very definitively saying what I think the gods are, because I feel like the moment I put that on paper or say it out loud, 10 minutes later, something will come into my head
Yeah.
that makes me go, oh no, I don't think that's right, actually. So, and I know that's probably a cop out, a way of
Well,
talking
I think
about
it's
it.
because it's fluid.
Yeah,
And I think it's because the relationships that we have in our human lives, they're always changing
absolutely.
and morphing and evolving. And I can't see why our relationship with the gods would be any different.
No, and I think that's the key word to a lot of my own practice. And when people ask me, what is your witchcraft? What is your polytheism? What is your druidry? How does it exist in the world? If I have to succinctly describe what I do, I always narrow it down to it's all about relationship and relationality. So my relationship with the people in my community, my loved ones, my family, but also the unseen members of my community, the very living, animate qualities of the land itself. They are there and they are present, and then the gods, and then the spirits that I interact with on a daily basis. They're all part of everything that I do, and it's a constant rejigging and working of that relationship that makes my practice what it is. And like you just said, our relationship with people is fluid and constantly changes. And I find that that's exactly what my relationship with the gods, with spirits, with anything in that nature is also like too. And what I find particularly interesting as well is sometimes I will meet people who will say to me, well, how do you then reconcile the fact that, people have different understandings of the gods? Why does Ceridwen appear to one person as a woman dressed in medieval dresses with, very lovely bosoms who stirs her cauldron and looks very sexual, and to another person, a crone-like figure who is wise and a sagely figure cloaked in velvet, and then to someone else, she's a fabulous woman dressed in Dior and wandering down the streets of Bala with her little clutch bag looking fabulous. How do the gods appear in such different ways to different people? Does that not make it feel like maybe they're just in our heads? And I always reply to that with, well, I'm a different person to everybody who meets me. You're a different person to everybody who meets you. Like, and some people will struggle with this because they'll go, no, no, I always act exactly the same with everyone. Yes, but they don't perceive you the
Yeah,
same all the time. They will see you through their lens and through their experiences. So to some people, I'm a weird, flamboyant, whimsical little lunatic who loves to run around talking about magic and collecting troll dolls, and I'm just this explosion of glitter and rainbows in their eyes. To others, they might see me as really standoffish and might see me as perhaps a little intimidating, and other people might just think I'm really rude and really mean. And that doesn't mean that that's who I am. That just means that that's who they've seen. And I think that is how some people interact with the gods too.
yeah.
We see a version of the gods that is influenced by our own perceptions.
Because it's drag, right?
Yeah, literally.
Basically, we're all in drag,
Mhm.
and so are the gods. I mean,
Absolutely.
when you mentioned Ceridwen. Every time I see Ceridwen, she's always in skinny jeans, a really nice sweater with stylish but affordable boots,
Mm.
and that's how I've always seen her. Very typical of Bala, maybe, but and but it's true. To me, that is her drag. It's the way she appears to me, and I guess it says something about the relationship that I have with her. So, do you find my experience of the gods? There are some of which I have daily affinities with. We obviously live on an island that's named after a mother figure. So, because this is my first point of reference whenever I wake up and when I go to bed, Morn is always there. So she's always like almost like background radiation. This constant presence here on this island, and then the sea is very close, and hence Llŷr is very close. But I find that with the rest, of which you go into some detail, breaking down who the different gods are, and you name some of them, give us a little bit of insight into their personalities and expressions. But I also find that I'm fairly promiscuous with my gods, and that some will pop in and pop out. Branwen, I feel, is close, but not always prevalent, not always very present. And then sometimes I feel that she is present. And but I like that fluidity of relationship as well, because that's exactly how we are with human beings.
Yeah.
We may not see a friend for 12 months and there's a quick catch up and it's as if no time has gone at all. And I find that my relationship with the gods is very much like that. So when we consider polytheists today, there's always a question that will arise, that if somebody all the way over in deepest, brightest Montana suddenly feels a compulsion, or from the peaks of the cherry blossom hills of Japan, that, oh my gosh, I'm suddenly being called by Arianrhod or Branwen or Llŷr. Who on earth is this person? As a Welsh person, is that connection that they have with that particular deity in any way appropriative from a cultural perspective, or appreciative of culture? And is there a grey area in the middle that could be a little bit dodgy?
Mm. See, I think an interesting aspect of Welsh culture in particular is that we're a nation and a culture that has long lived in shame of who we are. You often say it, that like nobody feels shame like the Welsh sometimes. We're taught almost to be ashamed of who we are. And I've always found it frustrating how people don't generally know who we are outside of, say, Britain or Britain and Ireland. You don't really meet that many people who know much about Wales. And I remember my experience with this was when I went to university and I met people from Greece and, America and international students that were there from the Netherlands and Germany. And they would often ask me, "Where are you from?" And I'd say Wales, and they'd say, "Oh, a county in England," and these kind of things. I think because of that, because of the fact that we're often overlooked, that we're misunderstood, that we're not really given much attention on the global field, to me, and I don't know if every Welsh person in the world feels like this, but when somebody develops a desire to learn more about Welsh culture, it just fills me with joy and glee. It makes me want to go, yes, come hug us, come interact with us, come learn about our language, come eat some cawl, come, have some Welsh rarebit with me. Let's have a panad and sit down and have some abthraw cakes or Welsh cakes, and let's talk about everything that you're drawn to at the minute. Like there is this desire to like, yes, come and interact with us. And because of that, I would never dissuade anyone from wanting to interact with the gods. If they're feeling a pull, then they should follow that. And it's not up to us to say who the gods interact with. So I'm always fine with that. If people are, asking my permission, not that I would ever feel like I'm an authority to give permission, but as someone raised in this culture, that's how I feel. It's if you are wanting to develop a relationship with these gods, we welcome you. And please listen to our music, eat our food, learn about our language. I think the grey area for me is when these gods are ripped out of their cultural context and native voices aren't listened to. They are transformed into something completely dissimilar to what we know them as, and sometimes they're used as just fodder for like fantasy writers or RPG writers or something like that. There's some people who will do that, who will rip them from their cultural contexts and make them into something completely different. And to me, that does rub against me the wrong way.
That is appropriated, right?
Yeah,
And that has happened, particularly through the 80s and 90s and even into the noughties within pagan culture. It happened. But I think you hit on something really quite special there as well in come over, eat our cawl, eat our Welsh cakes, because there is this fundamental tenet within not just Welsh culture, but within all of the different Celtic cultures that hospitality is one of the things that we take really seriously. Although do phone first and at least give us the time to vacuum and wash the dishes that have been in the sink since Tuesday. And but hospitality is really important, right, within our culture. And I always find that I've often had people say to me, no, people can't practice with Welsh gods because it's a closed practice. I'm like, no, it's never been. There isn't a practice to be too close. We've never been a closed culture, have we? We've always been willing to share.
Yeah, there's all manners of examples through history of Welsh people traveling the world, going and settling in new places, taking their music and their stories, not just across the world, people moving to Leeds, I don't know, anywhere like that. And they'll take parts of their culture with them and want to share them. And that's been the nature of our culture for so long. And I do think in some ways it is, like I was saying, a reaction to that suppression, that there is this almost desire to erase us from the global scale. So when we have the opportunity, we just want to share our language, our culture, our way of being, and make people aware that we're not just English, we're not just the little British people. We are our own culture with our own language, with our own identity, with our own history. And what I would always suggest to people who have an interest in the gods or in paganism through a Welsh expression is get to know the culture too. Understand a little bit about the history of who we are and why we are the way we are, why we have this shame about who we are, and why we're trying to break free of that now. Get to understand, just talking about this book, you were saying the fact it's called The Welsh is in and of itself quite lovely because it tells you what it is. But at the same time, I've had some people go, "Why did you go with Welsh and not Cymru?"
Cymru.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that in and of itself, look into that. Why is the term Welsh a little bit?
Why is that?
So
Trixie.
just learn a little bit about it, interact with the culture and the people rather than just seeing it as a fantasy. And I think that's what takes it away from cultural appropriation into appreciation, is when there's a care and a love for the culture and the people as well as the gods and the magic.
Very well said. So for anybody out there who is particularly interested, apart from, of course, buying a copy of Pantheon, the Welsh, available from wherever books are sold, how else should they go about it? What else could people do in order to widen their understanding, knowledge, information base, and perhaps move towards relationship with these divinities? What resources are there out there for them?
Well, first and foremost, I would say grab copies of things like the Mabinogi and learn about our myths and stories. If you are fortunate enough to live here in Wales or in Britain or close by enough, go see the landscape that has inspired these stories. If you have an interest in Cerridwen, go to Bala, go to the area where the magic happens, go to the places where the myths are situated, because our myths don't happen in a land far, far away long, long ago. They happen here.
Down the road.
Yeah, down the road. So have a relationship with the land if possible, but obviously that's not possible for everyone. So in lieu of that, read about it, interact with Welsh culture today, whether that's watching videos on the S4C YouTube channel or coming to people like me and you or Gwilym or anybody who's teaching from the context of Wales today about this stuff, interact with native voices. With that, I would say, the ADO has been, the ADO being the Anglesey Druid Order, which you're watching the podcast of right now, so you should know that. But just in case anybody doesn't, the Anglesey Druid Order ar Urdd Derwydd on Môn, if you reach out to the Urdd and you do one of the courses or something, that's another way you can interact with it. And that's how I deepened my relationship with these deities. I finally took the course and it just changed my perspective entirely. And that's as somebody who grew up here. So I can't imagine how transformative it would be to somebody who has no direct connection to the culture as well. And that's obviously both online and in person. You can choose which to do, and in both English and Welsh now. So you can choose the language as well. But also, people like me run courses and classes online as well. I've got my YouTube videos, my podcasts. There's so much material out there that is free and accessible nowadays. We're living in, an era where information is so easy to come across. So as well as buying books and such, you can also find all manners of material online, like this podcast, like my podcast and my YouTube videos, like the courses run by Gwilym Morris Baird, like the courses run by people like Chris Hughes, who are from outside of Wales, so they can give a different perspective to us, but, interact with native voices, interact with the culture, and just get to know us. Come have a panad.
And if you're unsure about something, reach out. Maybe you're unsure about how something is pronounced. You can always send little voice messages on Messenger, social media, and where possible, there'll be a little Welsh person who'll be more than willing to help. Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Oh, diolch yn fawr.
So are you excited that it is now out there in the big, vast, wide world?
Oh, excited and daunted. I hope people enjoy it, and I hope it offers a springboard to people who want to learn more. My hope was not that this would be like a Bible, that people would go, this is how to worship the Welsh gods, but instead just as a resource that they can go, okay, I want to learn about this. Let me look here first and then figure out my path from there. And hopefully, I've heard from some people that they do like it. So
fabulous. Oh, it's lovely. I've read it, as you can see, breaking spines and all sorts, but I'm a spine breaker.
You are.
And I like it. Ooh, no. Anyway, diolch yn fawr iawn I ti.
Thank
you very much. Mhara Starling's new book, Pantheon the Welsh, is now available wherever books are sold, published by Moon Books, a division of Collective Ink Limited. And if you would like to know more about the Anglesey Druid Order, please visit our website at angleseydruidorder.co.uk. We offer residential courses in Druidry as well as an online course. The next live online course begins in November, towards the end of November 2026, and runs for 12 months. You can get more details by either visiting our website, visiting our Facebook page or social media pages, or you can write to us directly at courses@angleseydruidorder.co.uk. We host ceremonies, rituals, events, workshops throughout the year. One of the best places to find us is on social media. So go to our Facebook page. We're of that generation, we're on Facebook rather than Threads, and find any information there. Reach out to us if you have any questions. Mi fydd yna gwrs yn cael ei gynnal I gyd gyfan gwbl trwy gyfrwng y Cymraeg yn dechrau yn 2027. Felly os ydych chi yn teimlo fel fysach chi yn hoffi dysgu mwy am dderwyddiaeth, mae'n croeso I chi ymuno gyda y cwrs. Ewch chi'n tudalennau ni ar y cyfrannau cymdeithasol am ragor fwy o wybodaeth. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am wrando neu am wylio, a mi welwn I chi tro nesa. So with all that being said, that was a plug for the Welsh language course, by the way, for the non-Welshies in the room. My thanks to Mhara Starling. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
O, diolch I chi.
And we shall see you all next time. Take care, have a lovely harvest season, and until next time, bye.